One thing I want to mention just for clarification, on the back of your bulletin you'll see a date. It says February 8th, and it also mentions a business meeting. Disregard that date and that information. We didn't get that changed in there, so that's just carried over in the information. So just wanted to clarify that in case somebody was worried that they needed to prepare something for a business meeting coming up. All right, Daniel chapter 3. Let us go ahead and begin reading in Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to assemble the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to attend the dedication of the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue the king had set up. Then they stood before the statue Nebuchadnezzar had set up. A herald loudly proclaimed, People of every nation and language, you are commanded, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the drum, and every kind of music, you are to fall face down and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and every kind of music, people of every nation and language fell down and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Some Chaldeans took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, May the king live forever. You as king have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have ignored you, the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up. Then in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue that I have set up? Now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue that I have made. But if you do not worship it, you will be immediately thrown into a furnace of blazing fire, and who is the God who can rescue you from my power? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this. If the God we serve exists, then he will rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you to know, king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than customary. He commanded some of the best soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So these men in their trousers, robes, head coverings, and other clothes were tied up and thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Since the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot, the raging flames killed the men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound down into the furnace of blazing fire. Then Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm, and he said to his advisors, Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire? Yes, of course, your majesty, they replied to the king. He exclaimed, Look, I see 4 men, not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come out. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And when the satraps, prefects, governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Not a hair on their head had been singed, and their robes were unaffected, and there was no smell of fire on them. Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He has sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I shall issue a decree that anyone of any people, nation, or language who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb, and his house be made a garbage dump. For there is no God who is able to deliver like this. Then the king rewarded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Let us go to the Lord in prayer this morning. Father God, we thank you this morning, Lord, for the word that you have given us. We thank you that you are an awesome God. We thank you that we have the opportunity to come into your home and to praise and worship you, Father, in this place that has been built for your name. God, we ask that each one of our hearts would be tilted towards you this morning. Father, that our hearts and thoughts would be focused on you, that our hearts would be good soil for the seed of your word, God, and that you would speak to us and draw us close to yourself. Father, just help your word to be alive in our hearts and our minds, Father, that we would live according to it. God, we just ask that your spirit be alive in this place and that it would just have free reign in our lives. And we ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. As we think about Daniel chapter 3, very familiar passage and very straightforward in what is happening here. It's not like some of the other ones where we're dealing with visions of future or past. It kind of echoes a statement that Jesus makes in John 17, verses 15 and 16, and it's a theme that will run through the message this morning. Jesus prays for his disciples, and he says, I am not praying that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of this world. And the thing that we have to remember, and the thing that I try to remind us of pretty frequently, is that we are not of this world. This world is not our home. We don't belong here. We have been saved out of this world. We have been called to a heavenly kingdom and an eternity with God. We are literally, as the hymn says, we are just passing through. The problem is a lot of times we get too comfortable where we're passing through. You know, it's kind of like that movie, I think it had Tom Hanks in it, where he's trapped in the terminal, in the airport. He just has to get comfortable because he can't go anywhere. And sometimes we get that way. We get too comfortable in this world that is not our home, and we try to get too comfortable and make it as much of a home as we can. We begin to lose focus that this isn't our place. So as we go through this morning, I want us to think about Jesus' words that he did not ask that God would remove the disciples from this world because they have a purpose and a job while they're here. He said, I want you to protect them from the enemy. And you think about that. You know, if it was simply that we get saved and that's it, then the Lord could just rapture each one of us up as we give our life to him. You're done. It's time to come home. But the fact that we are still here shows that he has purpose for our lives while we're here, to work and to do according to his good will. So as you think here in the words of Jesus, they were true then, they're true today, they were true even in the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And when we talk about the world, a lot of times we get confused what we mean when we talk about the world. When we're talking about the world, we're not talking about the earth. We're talking about the world system. You know, the reality is when you go to the book of Revelation, you see that God is going to make a new heaven and a new earth. He's going to purify this. So it's not so much the earth that we are not a part of. It is the world system. This system that is corrupted. This system that is controlled by the prince and the power of the air, who is in all these systems that we see about around the world. We're talking about this system of mankind, the government, the rule, the lifestyle, the goal. That is what we are not a part of. Now, I want us to think about 4 things as we see what the world system does. As we look at the situation here with Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we would look at the last chapter and be very confused and say, well, hang on a minute. I mean, just a minute ago, Nebuchadnezzar was praising Yahweh. talking about that there's no God who can do what he did. Now, we don't know exactly how much time has passed between chapter 2 and chapter 3. There's a lot of people that try to nail it down. Some people try to say it may be a year. There's no way for us to exactly know how much time has elapsed. But what we do know is that it doesn't take people very long to forget what God has done. Amen? Even for us, it's easy for us, even as God's people, to forget what God has done for us. Sometimes we're quick to trust him and believe in him in one moment, but then when something else happens, it's easy for us to backslide and say, well, God, where are you? You know, I heard a testimony of a lady on, I think it was Air One this week, and she was talking about how she had battled cancer for many years and had gone to the doctor, and the doctor said that, and I can't remember the specific kind, but it's essentially the cancer had come back, spread all over her body, into her lymph nodes, into her jaw. It just wasn't looking good. So she began to pray, and she began to ask people to pray for her. She told her doctor, she said, well, you know, I guess we're just going to have to pray about this. And her doctor, not being particularly, fond of that concept, being a doctor, it's like, no, we've got our ways that we treat this kind of stuff. She goes back to the doctor, and I don't remember how long of a period it was before she went back to the doctor, but the doctor came back after having done a scan and said, well, you must have been praying because there's no cancer at all. Now, we hear testimonies like that, but it's very easy for us to forget when the problem comes home, right? When it's at our door, when it's our problem. It's easy for us to say, well, God, but I don't know that you're going to do that in my life. I don't know that you can do that for me. So it's very easy for us to get, and like we talked about last week, we have no indication that Nebuchadnezzar suddenly became a follower of Yahweh. He acknowledged that Yahweh did something that no other God could do, but he still held on to the fact that, well, I've got all these other gods too. And all these other gods have abilities and they all have powers. I mean, even his name has to do with a god, has to do with Nebu. It's the same one that Abednego is the same one. It is connected to that same God. Chances are that's the God, this statue, this man that he creates this golden image of, is probably of the god Nebu because that would directly tie to him. So in some ways, it's kind of a way for him to erect a statue to a god while at the same time confirming that he was also a minister of this God. So he's confirming worship of himself as well. There's 4 things the world system does. The first thing it does is it corrupts. You see that Nebuchadnezzar has allowed that image of the head of gold to go to his head, right? So he gets this vision like, oh, well, dude, I'm something special. I'm the head of gold. So he's like, well, hey, it makes sense. Let's make a statue to commemorate what I have done in the name of Nebu. So he builds this statue. He's forgotten who the God of gods is. He has corrupted worship. He's bringing worship to himself. He's bringing it to an image. You know, you look at when God gave the command to his people, he said, you are not to worship any other gods, and you're not to make any image to worship either. Because the reality is we cannot adequately make any image that would encompass the fullness of God. Anything we make would be less than he is. Therefore, it would be idolatry. Even in the beginning, when he had the Hebrews were making altars, he even told them, he said, when you make an altar, don't even fashion the stones. Make it out of raw stones. Because you think about it, when you cut it and you try to shape it yourself, you're trying to add your vision of beauty to it. So the focus becomes on the thing instead of the who. So you see the world system begins to corrupt worship. It begins to bring worship towards man. It begins to elevate mankind. You see this even today. We take things like the theory of evolution, that we are the greatest outcome of evolution. Therefore, we are the thing to be worshiped. Humanism. Humans are the greatest aspect of creation. Therefore, we're it. We're the top. There's no need for a God because we are it. Not only do they bring worship to man, but then they go beyond that and they try to create a perfect man. So it wasn't enough that Nebuchadnezzar be worshipped as a god. There had to be this perfect image of a man. So he builds it out of gold and fashions this statue. And you see this even in Egypt, how they would make all these statues of like a perfect image, even though they knew that, well, that's not really what they look like. But we're trying to create a perfect image so that we can worship this perfect created thing. And see, this is no different because when you go to the book of Revelation, you see the same thing happening there. The beast sets himself up first to be worshiped. Then what does he do after he sets himself to be worshiped? He creates an image and then tells the people to worship the image that has been created. So you see this corruption of God's design for worship. He is the only one worthy of worship. No thing, no person, no image. And yet you see this progression in the world system. The old Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar, the new Babylon with the beast. Both being a corruption of God's law and God's purpose. The first two commands, no other gods, no graven image. Not only does it corrupt worship, it corrupts people. Causes them to do things because of the corruption of the first thing. As we get our focus in the wrong place for worship, it begins to corrupt us. We begin to do things that are corrupt because there's no longer a standard by which we are to govern ourselves. We now get to make it up on our own. And you see this in our culture today. I mean, we literally, you can go to the doctor and you can say, "Doctor, make me perfect." Do all these surgeries, change my gender, whatever you want to do. Because we are pursuing some false image of perfection because we have corrupted worship of God. So everything else becomes corrupted in that. And the reality is Satan doesn't care what you worship as long as it is not the one true God. Because God plus anything is idolatry. Let me say that again. God plus anything is idolatry. He doesn't need anybody else. He is alone in himself, the I am. God even said when he was giving his commands, he says, "I don't need any helper to go along with me. So I don't need you to take Baal. I don't need you to take Nebu. I don't need you to take yourself and try to set yourself up with me to make me better than I already am, because I already am." God is it. And Satan doesn't care how religious we are, how spiritual we may find ourselves, as long as it is something that is corrupted from God's design. I mean, you look around us today, you see, cults that pop up, Christian cults, that are very, very close to the truth, but it's corrupted just enough to where it takes the deity of Christ. That's usually how you can tell. Because they take Christ and they bring him down just enough to where he's on level with us. And the goal of that is, well, if we can bring him down, we can bring ourselves up. That's the goal. Again, you see that here. The world system corrupts worship by first worshiping man. The second thing it does is it conforms. Because man is the highest object of its greatest goal, because man is the highest object, its greatest goal is survival. That's what we want to do. We want to live forever, right? You see all these things about how we can prolong our life. What is the goal? Because we're it. We think that this life is all there is to have, so we want to live as long as possible. In fact, if we could live forever, that would be great. The problem is, again, that is a corruption because God has already created us to live forever, but it's to be in a relationship with Him. Not here. Not in this corruption. But it conforms. It conforms to whatever it must to survive. And it doesn't mind following and worshiping whatever it must do to survive. It will even conform to your side as long as it's convenient. You know, we've seen this probably over the last 3 or 4 years. You'll see these big name people that suddenly start to follow Christianity. And suddenly everybody rallies around them and says, oh, look at this person. They're now on our side. So we begin to pull them in and accept them because we like what credibility they give us. And then you see real quick how they begin to turn because it's no longer convenient for them. Once they've got what they wanted, well, it's like, hey, I don't need you anymore. And you see here, when you look at, as Nebuchadnezzar makes this declaration, again, making it in opposition, probably wasn't even aware of the ramifications that this decree would have on people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He's not even thinking that. That's not in his wheelhouse. He's lost. But you look at what the satraps, you look at what the Chaldeans do. I mean, these men were just saved by the Jews, right? I mean, Daniel just spared all of these people. But you know what? They found an opportunity to elevate themselves. It's like, hey, if we can throw them guys under the bus, we'll do it. Again, Daniel was not seeking glory for himself. He was seeking to give God glory. The Chaldeans are looking for glory themselves. Why? Because they're lost. They're part of this world system. So they're trying to elevate themselves, so they see an opportunity. Hey, we can get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of there. We can get set up as the leaders. Those guys don't need to be there. So as long as it benefits them, they will conform. We also have to remember that even when God has allowed a system to exist, that doesn't mean we're part of it. I mean, we read in chapter 1 how God brought Nebuchadnezzar for this purpose. That didn't change the fact that his people were a set-apart people. They were not part of this system. Third thing that it does is it controls. What doesn't conform is a threat. So it has to control. If they don't bow, what does he say will happen? He gives the order. He says, everyone will bow. When you hear the music playing, everyone will bow. And if you don't bow, we're going to throw you into the fiery furnace. Now, I don't know about you, but man, death by fire does not sound pleasant. I mean, it just don't sound good. And this was something that was pretty common for him to do. There's actually accounts, I think in Jeremiah, where it mentions him executing people by throwing them into the fire. So this isn't new. They knew exactly what it was like whenever he executed somebody this way. But if they can't control you, they get rid of you. You see this again in the book of Revelation. Those who would not conform to the system of the beast, what does he do? He kills them. He, sets them apart so that they can't be part of the system, because if you won't conform, you're a problem. Those who have been corrupted, who have conformed, the reality is they will be against us. The Chaldeans had one goal in mind. In fact, they could have even had something to do with the way that Nebuchadnezzar issued the decree. We don't know. We know they took the opportunity. But you think about Jesus' words in John 15 and 19. He says, if you were of this world, the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of this world, I chose you out of the world. Therefore, the world hates you. See, again, confirming the idea that we are not of this world. Not only is he told us we're not of this world, the world knows that we're not of this world, because the world will hate us because we're in the light and they are in the darkness. So we can't expect the world system to suddenly start to conform to what we think it should. It's a lost system. It is a system of man, and it is corrupted. So even when it looks like it may be in favor of us, we've got to remember that at any moment it can turn on a dime and be against us, because we are not its goal. Control and power and corruption is its goal. We know what the enemy's goal is. It says he is to steal, kill, and destroy. So anything that he can do to gain that, he will do it. But we are not of this world. You think about just a few years ago, we had some examples of this. Hey, if you don't obey, we may close your doors. COVID was going around, right? Well, we're telling you can't meet. We're telling you got to close your doors, and if you don't, we'll shut them for you. If you don't listen to us, you think about, churches talking about political issues. This was especially true when there was a lot of debate about abortion. People were trying to remove churches' tax-exempt status because, now you're getting political. You're talking about abortion. You're talking about political issues. So, if you do that, you're going to lose your tax-exempt status. And I kid you not, I've heard of churches that have said, we can't do that because we might lose our tax-exempt status. If we don't conform, we will be punished. And we're worried about the wrong system. The fourth thing that the world system does after it corrupts, it conforms, it controls, and then it condemns. If it can't be controlled, then it will be condemned. It may condemn us in character. You see, that's how the Chaldeans started. Verse 8, it says, some Chaldeans took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. They slandered them. Look at these guys. Yeah, you put these guys over the provinces of Babylon, but let me tell you what they're doing. They're inciting rebellion. They're saying they're not going to follow your decree. Doesn't matter if you're the king or not. They're not going to worship your statue. They're not going to worship your God. And when that doesn't work, death. You look at what Nebuchadnezzar does. Nebuchadnezzar, to his credit, he was angry, but he invites them in and he says, this is verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue that I have set up? See, you can almost hear in his voice, he's trying to be reasonable. He says, look, now if you're ready, guys, I'm giving you an opportunity. If you're ready, when you hear the music play, bow down and worship. I'm going to give you a shot. Way to redeem yourself. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. Essentially what they're saying is, we don't really need to even give you an answer. We don't need to respond. Because if our God is real, he can save us. It doesn't matter what our response is. What matters is who our God is. Because again, it's not about them. It's not about what their ability is. It's what about his ability, the one they worship. But see, God's system works a little bit different. God gives us a declaration. He is able. You look at what they say. They said, if the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. They knew their God was able. There's nothing that our God can't do. Now, you could have a battle of gods and say, this God and that God. But they said, not even you, king, the one who's standing before us, the one who seemingly has all the power and authority, he can save us from you. Because they knew the gods weren't going to do anything, right? I mean, he could pray to the gods all day, and the gods aren't going to do nothing to him. But Nebuchadnezzar at least had physical power to do something. And he says, he will deliver us from you. You look at what they continue, it says, but even if he does not rescue us, we want you to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up. They didn't exactly know what God would do, but they knew he could and he would do something. And see, we struggle with that because a lot of times we want God to do what we want him to do, how we want him to do it, and when we want him to do it. But you notice what Matthew 10, 19, and 20 tells us. It's talking about persecution. He says, when they hand you over, don't worry about how or what you will speak, for you will be given what to say in that hour, because it isn't you speaking, but the power of the Holy Spirit in you. See, we don't have to worry about how we answer in these situations because it will be God that is giving the answer in these situations. Just like here, God is fixing to answer the king. He's fixing to let him know real quick what the answer is to this question. What God can save you? Yahweh's like, hang on a second, I'll show you. And see, it's the same way in our life. God is waiting and wanting to do miraculous things, but a lot of times we're not willing to let him because we want the control. We want the answer the way that we want it. They had faith to know that he could, but they had humility to know his will may be something different. And see, that's where we struggle, right? See, this is in opposition to what a lot of times we come to God with. It's that if God will, then statement. If God will fix my situation, then I'll follow him. God, if you'll heal my marriage, I'll follow you. God, if you'll fix my financial problems, I'll follow you. But you see what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said. We will follow God, period. Doesn't matter if he does anything else. We're not going to worship any other God because we know who the real God is. And if it's his will for my life that I die in this fire, so be it. But what I'm not going to do is doubt who he is. And again, a lot of times we try to come to salvation that way. You know, y'all have heard me tell stories about when we were involved in Judgment House before. You'd have people that would come in the counseling room and say, well, you know, I've got all these problems in my life. You know, I'm gonna follow Jesus. If he will take care of this situation, then I'll follow him. I mean, you think back to the disciples. Jesus was dealing with a second group of people that came to him, and one guy's like, you know, I got to go home and take care of some business. I need to go back home and bury somebody. I got things I got to do first, then I'll follow you. He says, he who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom. See, we don't realize sometimes what we're being called out of and to. And we think the thing that is happening around us is so great and so powerful. And the reality is, man, this is all just temporary stuff. When we're talking to God, we're dealing with eternal things. But so many times we fall on that if God will, then statement. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we're not having any of that. It's not conditional on anything that happens. It's not conditional on God performing a certain way because God is not obligated to do anything for us. I mean, in fact, the fact that he gave us salvation through Jesus Christ, which again, he was not obligated to do, is already more than we ever deserved to begin with. So anything else is just his mercy and his grace being extended to us. But he's not obligated to any of it. He wasn't obligated to save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He did that because he wanted to show who he was to all these other people. He wanted all these other people to know who the real God is so that they could worship the one true God. Because God's mission is to restore the world to himself. This world that has corrupted its ways, this world that has gone after itself, this world that chose to worship other things, he wants to reconcile this world to himself. I mean, it tells us in the New Testament that he is slow for his return because he doesn't want anyone to perish, but all to come to the knowledge of Christ. He wants to reconcile all of it. So he's trying to reveal himself to Nebuchadnezzar and the whole people of Babylon so that they will know who the one true God is. And he's doing that through his people. The second thing we see after he gives us a declaration is he gives us deliverance. Deliverance may come before the fire. It may come in the fire. It may come after the fire. Again, we don't exactly know all the time how God is going to work, but what we do know is that he is able. However he chooses to do, he is able to do all things. Just like we aren't delivered out of this world yet. Sometimes we want to be. Sometimes we're ready to be. Lord, would you just take me? You don't know how crazy these people are down here. Would you just take me home? Lord, I'm just tired of all this craziness. It's like it ain't time yet. I've got purpose for you. I've got a plan, and you're part of that will. So he still has us here, and as Jesus prayed, Lord, protect them while they're in the world. He gives us deliverance. You think about even in the last days. You read the book of Revelation, you see a lot of comparisons here in chapter 3, but you see in the last days some people are martyred. Some people do lose their life. The beast is on a mission to eradicate these people. But then some people are alive at his coming. So some people God allows to make it through this time because they're going to see him coming back. They will be alive at his return. So we see both of that. Some people are delivered because the Lord allows them to be taken out. Some people he delivers by carrying them through it so they can see it all the way to the end. But what we know is that he is able to protect his people and to give us deliverance. You know, and it's crazy because, you know, I'm one of those people like, I don't know, sometimes I look too deep into the science of stuff because, you know, that's the way my brain works. But I was asking Leanne about something yesterday, and she's like, why are you even looking into this? You know, because I was looking into what happens on a molecular level when something is burned. Because I'm like, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went into a blazing fire. And there's we think of things they just turn crispy, you know. But there's actually like this science that is happening molecularly when you are exposed to fire. And it's crazy because what happens is your molecules and your cells begin to move really fast. Whenever things heat up, they move faster. So your cells are actually trying to pull themselves apart and become new compounds and molecules. So when you're exposed to that much heat, like the water in your body is trying to separate, it's trying to pull itself apart because of the extreme heat, and then you actually become other molecules. So when you think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it says that he had the fire heated way over. He's like cranking it up to 11. Like, guys, it's time to turn it up. Not that it's going to change the outcome. It's more of a reflection of his anger. You're going to die either way. But he says, we want to crank this thing up as hot as possible. And when they throw him in, they tie him up and they throw him in. And these men fall, it says they fall bound down into the furnace. So on a scientific level, their bodies are literally trying to be pulled apart by this heat to change their whole molecular structure. Nature is working against them as they fall into this. And yet, what do we see happening? It's like Colossians 1:17 that says, He holds all things together in Himself. I mean, you think about that. When Nebuchadnezzar throws these men in, it says, he jumps up in alarm and he says, didn't we throw 3 men, this is verse 24, into the fire? He says, I see a 4th man. There's someone else in this fire. And He's holding them together. They're not injured. In fact, they're not bound. I mean, the heat had its effects on the ropes that they were tied up with, and yet did not touch a hair on their body. In fact, they didn't even smell like smoke. And that's pretty remarkable. You know, I know a lot of y'all guys like to smoke meat. You get that smoker going, man, you come in the house and you're smelling like it, right? And you ain't even by the heat. And it says they didn't even smell like smoke. I mean, He literally encased them in protection. They were in His presence. And nothing could touch them. Because they were in His will. You know, I heard a statement one time, and I don't remember who it was contributed to, but it said, the most dangerous place in all the world to be is outside of the will of God. Because when we're in the will of God, there is literally nothing that can touch us without His say-so. So it doesn't matter if you're in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. If you're in the will of God, you are the safest you could ever be. But if we're outside the will of God, man, it don't matter if we're at Safeway, we ain't safe. Because we're out of the will of God. And I mean, there ain't nothing that protects us greater than He does. And you know, it may be unexplainable, it may be unidentifiable, it doesn't change what He does. I mean, you couldn't go back to this moment and try to run a test to say, well, scientifically, how did this happen? Because there's no scientific reason or logic to it. But we have a God that works outside of the laws of nature because those things are created by Him. So He can manipulate any of those things at any given time that He so chooses because they are subject to Him as Lord over His creation. I mean, see, that's why we're safest in His will, because there's literally nothing. Nature itself has no effect on us because we have a God that controls those things. I mean, you look in the New Testament, there was times where people teleported. I mean, Philip was one place, and then suddenly he's in another place and he's running upside a chariot. All for the sake of the gospel, because there was an Ethiopian eunuch that needed to hear the gospel at that moment. So God's like, I need you here right now. I mean, it's crazy stuff. We serve an awesome God. I mean, these aren't just stories in a book that are made to strengthen our faith. These are people in history who saw God work in their life because of their faith. Because their faith was in Him. The last thing that God does after He gives us a declaration, He gives us deliverance, then He gives us distinction. He sets us apart. 1 Peter 2:9, it says, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. He has set us apart so that we can set Him apart. It is so that we can proclaim who He is. Why did God raise these 4 Hebrew boys up where they were? So that they could proclaim who God was. You have Daniel, who admits of himself, no one can interpret and give you this dream, but God can. And God did. There's no one, there's no thing that can deliver from the fiery furnace except God can. And He does it so that they will know that there is one God who can do all these things. There's a God that can do something that nobody else thinks He can. And that is Yahweh. Verse 25, he says, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods." Again, Nebuchadnezzar's not converted. Nebuchadnezzar's like, there's something happening in this fire, and whoever that guy is, there's something special about that fourth man. Not only that, he could tell the difference between the fourth man and the other guys. Because he says, I see someone else, and he looks different. He is set apart. He ain't like anybody else. That's exactly what Jesus is. He ain't like anybody else. That's why He's able to save. That's why He was given the name above every name. Because only at the name of Jesus Christ can we be saved. So Nebuchadnezzar goes up to the thing, calls them out. He says, "Servants of the Most High God, come out." And all the people are gathered around, the satraps, prefects, all these guys that were gathered around, all the leaders are there. They witness what God can do. God exalted His people at just the right time so that everybody could see what God could do. Again, not what they did. These men didn't lead a rebellion. These men didn't overthrow the king. These men were submissive to God. And God did something. God elevated Himself. Nebuchadnezzar exclaims, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angels and rescued His servants who trusted Him." I mean, look at the testimony coming out of the mouth of a pagan king. There is no one like this God. These men have been rescued by their God. Why? Because they were faithful. They weren't willing to violate their God for anyone else. So he issues a decree that any people who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be torn limb from limb and his house be made a garbage heap. Because there is no other God who is able to deliver like this. See, when God makes distinction, He distinguishes His people and He distinguishes Himself from all other things. Think about that lady's testimony. God did what doctors could not do. Didn't require any treatment, didn't require any chemo or radiation. God said, "I'm going to heal you because I'm going to show who I am to this doctor and to this staff. These people that are relying on something else, I'm going to show them where the true power is, and it's in me." Because He's bringing glory and honor to Himself. He has set us apart so that we will set Him apart as well. Church, as we look at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we got to remember the world wants to corrupt. It wants us to conform. It wants to control us. And when it doesn't, it will condemn us because we're not part of it. It does not love us because we are not of this world. But God will give us a declaration. In the midst of whatever trial we face, God will give us a declaration when we are faithful. We can declare that He is God and He is able in whatever situation. He will give us deliverance and make a distinction. Church, we've just got to decide that we're going to be faithful. Again, the same God that was working in the life of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the same God that is alive today. The same fourth man that showed up in the fiery furnace is the same one that showed up on this earth to save us. Again, when all of nature and all of creation is warring against us, we've got a God that is able to deliver us in spite of everything else that is going on. We've just got to trust Him. And it's not a trust that comes with, well, God, if, then I will. It is a faith that says, God, yes, whatever else. God, I want you to save me. God, I want you to be Lord of my life. God, I repent of my sin and I turn to you for forgiveness. In spite of all the stuff that's going on around us, God, I want you to be my God, and I want to serve you. Whatever your will is, Lord, I submit to that. I'm going to ask Ricky to come. We're going to have a time of invitation. During this time of invitation, not only is it our opportunity to respond to the message, but as we prepare to take the Lord's Supper, we also want to evaluate our life. We want to make sure that we are ready to partake of the Lord's Supper. So wherever our heart is this morning, whatever our spiritual need is this morning, would we be willing to respond to the move of the Holy Spirit this morning? As each one of us stands, we have this invitation. Whatever your need is, if it's for salvation, repentance, would you move this morning?